Years since Centennial College started, we're pleased tonight to have Elizabeth Knoll with us. She grew up on the University of Nebraska campus, but is the only member of her family not to have attended the University of Nebraska. Although she has a PhD, she never became a professor. All the same, she ended up in the family business. For many years, she was an editor at Harvard University Press, where she created a list in higher education that has been very successful, and that she sees as her greatest editorial accomplishment. She is now assistant provost for faculty appointments at Harvard and a part-time freshman advisor. Her specialty is ambitious, hopeful, insecure girls from the South and the Midwest. I give you Elizabeth Knoll.
It is such a pleasure to be here. I must say that except for babysitting Jerry Petters and Ted Beck's children, I contributed absolutely nothing to Centennial. The reason I am here is because my father is not here, so that I can say something about what Centennial meant to him, and also can say what I know that he would say if he were here. Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to see you. The creation of Centennial and the steering of it in those first 2 years, I think, brought out all my father's strengths and his vulnerabilities. If anyone were born to be a teacher and a citizen, it was he. He had scholarly values, but he was too fond of people and perhaps insufficiently methodical to be a scholar's scholar. He was devoted to students, first, last, and always, and particularly undergraduates, and particularly, I think, Nebraska undergraduates, whom he felt he understood. But in 1969, neither he nor anyone else fully understood the students or the times, and the discoveries came with costs. Robert Knoll was endlessly intellectually curious through talk, travel, and study. All his life, reading was his liberation, his antidepressant, and his food. Emotionally, he was the opposite of autistic. He fell to everyone else's feelings. These qualities helped to make him the wonderful teacher, interlocutor, friend, and father that he was. But they are not a great combination of qualities to have for an academic administrator. And I speak from experience. You care too much. You second guess yourself too much. Being senior fellow was one of the most demanding jobs of his life. Centennial was this big, visible project that he helped bring into being, for which he had great responsibility, which morphed into something more ambitious, more uncertain, and more contentious than anyone expected beforehand. Perhaps if Centennial had been born in 1965 or 1966, when it was first a gleam in some hopeful eyes, things might have been different. But it was 1969, which was followed by 1970, and the invasion of Cambodia, the shootings at Kent State, and at the university, the occupation of the ROTC building, when, as he put it, structure had become an unholy word. He ended up feeling squeezed from all sides. The most academically conservative members of the faculty, the administration, the Board of Regents, and the politically conservative parents and citizens of the state. And of course by the students and some of the other fellows at CEP. He was squeezed within himself. He put on a black armband and marched in the October 1969 protest at the Capitol against the Vietnam War. But at the same time, partly out of lifelong habit, and partly because he knew how the alumni responded to photographs of barefoot students sitting on the floors and talking to philosophical janitors, he always wore a jacket and tie, and he kept his hair cut in a crew cut as severe as H.R. Haldeman's. So let me tell you, dinner time at our house during those years wasn't always a whole lot of fun. My mother has instructed me to say here that I was a teenager at that point, and so I was not exactly a little ray of sunshine myself. The original plan for Centennial was to create a community of learners and potential scholars in the increasingly vast university that seemed to have become a world of procedures and strangers. The hope was that smaller, more informal classes in a residential setting with more familiar faces and more self-directed choice would bring energy and inspiration to the life of the mind. He was methodologically adventurous, but not radical. As Robert Knoll and psychologist Robert Brown wrote together in a few years later in Experiment in Nebraska, the book that was a report on the first 2 years, in our original statements of purpose, we assumed that Centennial would find new ways of arriving at old values. We did not reject what was commonly understood as academic excellence. Our innovations were to be in the means, not the end of education. Process, not product, came to be our slogan. We rejected salvation by works and asserted salvation by intellectual commitment. Works would come later. Our initial assumptions of the value of the rationally examined life were those standard since Aristotle. The trouble, I think, was that my father and other planners, being so intellectual by nature and training, may have overestimated how compelling intellectual curiosity was on its own for other people, particularly very young other people. Moreover, my father belonged to a generation of young men who wanted to do what the national authorities wanted them to do, that is, go to war. My father and many others of his generation crammed their undergraduate degrees into 3 years so that they could go. But they were teaching a generation that most emphatically did not share that obedient instinct. Under the circumstances, natural curiosity and Aristotle were not enough. At least not enough to sustain focus across weeks and months, at least not without the grades that had been, as he put it, the whip and the carrot for the preceding 12 years. As Experiment in Nebraska notes, students kept asking the fellows to define our goals. Robert Knoll wrote that they were defined. He quotes the original prospectus in the book. But as he and Robert Brown acknowledged, those high-minded academic statements may have been too abstract, too bloodless, too disengaged for the times. The students wanted to escape books and get into political and social action, to observe schools, to make surveys, to examine small towns. In a way that not all the fellows expected, especially the senior fellow, from the beginning, the implicit assumptions about academic excellence were challenged. Students should strive to find themselves, to seek personal development. Process, not product, stayed the slogan, but what was the product? The product came to be something like the complete human being. The process was psychic, not purely rational. And the empiricist Brown and the literary Knoll asked, but how were we to measure psychic growth? Indeed, how were we to recognize it when we saw it? Yet through those endless debates and the wrangling over grades and the possibility of group work, something happened. And what had happened was due to the fact and the spirit of Centennial. The data-driven chapters by Robert Brown, comparing Centennial students to their counterparts in the greater university, tell us that by the end of the year, the Centennial students were far more reflective than others, more interested in ideas, had a greater tolerance for novelty. They thought they had changed for the better. Bob Brown asked, what's the proper balance between intellectual and personal development here? Well, that's a good question, and it's a question that universities ask themselves in various forms to this day. When my father stepped down after 2 years, he was confident that Ted Beck would be a first-class senior fellow. He was. I know how inspiring Ted was for many of you and others not here. At that point, my father was exhausted. Largely, I think, because he feared that Centennial had not been what it should have been, and so that meant that he had not been up to the job. But he blamed himself, not you. In this turmoil, as always, Robert Knoll was on your side. That doesn't mean he always agreed with you, by no means, but he believed in your possibilities. For him, it was the responsibility of teachers, the teachers and the grown-ups, to give the students a chance, to meet them where they were, to speak so that they could hear. It was a highly paternalistic position, I grant you. There was no way he thought students were his equals. But he would say, if he didn't know more than they did, then he must have wasted his life. As the years passed, his memories brightened. He still didn't really want to talk about Centennial. But when I reread his account of those years in Prairie University, I had to laugh. Every single adjective ascribed to students as journalists or activists is positive. The account of the legislature, on the other hand, is extremely tight-lipped. And he allowed himself to say of the Board of Regents of the time that one was a lobbyist with a conflict of interest, one never turned up for meetings, one was in active controversy with his governing professional medical society, and one was, at best, eccentric. On the subject of Centennial and other ventures, he quoted Ned Hedges to say what he couldn't say himself, that many persons who subsequently achieved positions of public notice in the legislature and elsewhere had been Centennial students or in allied experimental programs as undergraduates. Although co-written by two Roberts, Experiment at Nebraska is surprisingly unified. Their different intellectual orientations harmonize in the conclusions that any new educational venture needs a clear purpose, a major purpose, and perhaps a single purpose, and a clear measure of success. Faculty must agree on both from the start, but must also be attuned to who the actual students are and adapt in some way to them. The Knoll part of the conclusion is the emphasis on responsiveness, pushing back against the time's harsh judgment of students who had too little deference and too much hair. He wrote, "Our students are not less interested in their teachers and not less willing to respect them than they have been, but we appear to them now as human beings. Our students search for wisdom, and they expect us to be searching too. They want us to help them find their way through their lives in this world. They seem to feel that our learning should be not so much of something as for something. No professor should get involved in any contemporary educational venture unless he is willing to expose his moral and political and social assumptions, as well as his professional knowledge and skills. Students are cannibals, of course. They will absorb as much of our time and life as they can reach, but their very cannibalism is evidence of their need." Robert Brown was obviously right to insist that a program needed definable, measurable outcomes. But I can hear Robert Knoll saying that the problem with measurable outcomes is that you can't be sure when you should be doing the measuring. 5 years? 20 years? 50 years? Prairie University was published in 1995. When Experiment at Nebraska was published, the country was still embroiled in Southeast Asia. Nixon was still president. The trials and non-trials of those guilty of the massacre at My Lai were underway. The 1972 May Day protests were overwhelming the Washington Mall. The air was dark with acrimony and paranoia. Remembering all that, I am particularly touched by the last paragraph. In any innovative program, faculty and students are likely to find themselves in great fluctuations of temper and enthusiasm. Euphoria is followed closely by something like despair, and for periods everybody is likely to feel confused. We are convinced that this fluctuation is no cause for alarm. Without it, the excitement of the new venture would be lost, and the mediocrity of the great world would descend. One must remember that results are not likely to be available quickly, that failure and success can only be gauged years after the fact. As in society generally, the key is faith. My father was, to put it very mildly, not a sports fan. But he would have agreed with Yogi Berra, it's not over till it's over. So on behalf of the long dead first senior fellow of the Centennial Educational Program, and all the Knowles who backed him up and lived through Centennial with him, welcome home.